Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon and happy International Women's Day. My name is Nagai Pendel and I'm the Dean of the Allard School of Law. Before we begin today's program, I would like to acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver campus is on the traditional, unceded and ancestral territory of the Musqueam people. We have a number of people joining us on Zoom, and so want you to, from places near and far, and so those on Zoom can acknowledge the places that they're from and the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. The Allard School of Law is honored to host the 11th Annual Southin Lecture this year. As you may know, this lecture is held alternately between the Allard School of Law and the University of Victoria School of Law. This lecture recognizes and pays tribute to Madam Justice Mary Southin's many contributions to the development of the common law in British Columbia and recognizes two important influences on the legal profession: British Columbia legal history and the law of equity. I would like to thank the Honorable Mary Southin's friends and colleagues, some of whom are here today, for establishing this lecture in her name. The Honorable Mary Southin graduated from the law school at UBC in 1952. She was called to the bar in 1953 and earned a tremendous reputation with the bench, her colleagues, and litigants. She represented a wide range of clients in a very broad litigation practice, which included criminal defense, family relations, labor, administrative hearings, and complicated commercial litigation. The Honorable Mary Southin became the first woman appointed Queen's Counsel in 1969. The first woman elected as a bencher in 1971, and the first woman to become the treasurer of the Law Society in 1977. She was the editor-in-chief of the British Columbia Law Reports from 1979 until her appointment to the Supreme Court of British Columbia in 1985. She was appointed to the Court of Appeal in 1988, only the second woman on the British Columbia Court of Appeals, and retired in 2006. Unfortunately, Mary was unable to join us today, but she does send her regards. And so it's now my pleasure to introduce this year's lecturers, Professor Sarah Morales from the University of Victoria, and Professor Estair van Wagner from Osgoode Hall Law School, York University. Professor Morales is Coast Salish and a member of the Cowichan tribes. She teaches torts, transsystemic torts, Coast Salish law and languages, legal research and writing, and field schools. Prior to joining the faculty at the University of Victoria, she taught at the University of Ottawa, Faculty of Law, where she taught Aboriginal law, Indigenous legal traditions, and international human rights with a focus on Indigenous peoples. Professor Morales' research centers on Indigenous legal traditions, specifically the traditions of the Coast Salish people, Aboriginal law and human rights as well. She has been active with Indigenous nations and NGOs across Canada in nation building, inherent rights recognition, and international human rights law. Professor Van Wagner researches and teaches in the areas of natural resource law and property law and how these intersect with Indigenous rights. She's co-director of Osgoode's Environmental Justice and Sustainability Clinic. Her work explores how law is used to structure relations with the environment and place. Professor Van Wagner joined Osgoode in 2017 from the Victoria University of Wellington Faculty of Law in New Zealand, where she taught property, natural resource, and resource management law. So really looking forward to hearing your words today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Morales and Professor Van Wagner.
Aitzapka, Aitzquail. We are so honored and grateful for the opportunity to speak to you today about one of the most significant yet underestimated and underexamined illustrations of the complex entanglement of settler and Indigenous people-place relations in Canada. Although arguably everyone is connected in some way to place through our lived experiences and through this work, we have come to recognize and appreciate the special relationships that Hul'qumi'num maintain with the places they have inhabited since the beginning of creation. These places, which range in scale from specific locales as small as a boulder or a bathing pool, and as large as a mountainside or watershed, are deeply imbued with meaning and are sites of personal, family, and community identity. My dear friend, late Joey Caro, expressed this so beautifully when he stated, quote, "We look at Mount Zuhalem and we see the basking frog and flood story. We see the mouth of the Cowichan River and we see the whale and the thunderbird fighting. And we see the headstones over by the Comiacan Church. We see all the legends and battles and stories that have happened, and old village sites and burial sites. And our history is interwoven into this land. This is our home. This is us. We are it. This is home for us. We can't go to Ireland and feel that. We can't even go to Nisga'a territory and feel that. This is it here." End quote. But these landscapes also tell of a different narrative, one of the interplay between Hul'qumi'num and common law, which has altered the landscapes of southern Vancouver Island in very tangible ways, and reminds the Hul'qumi'num of a different history and an unresolved land question. In 1887, the Esquimalt Nanaimo Railway Company was granted over 800,000 hectares of Coast Salish and Uchalna territory on southern Vancouver Island without treaty, consent, or compensation of those nations. Those familiar with the legal history of BC's Confederation will know that the grant was payment for the construction of 115 kilometers of rail line between Esquimalt and Nanaimo, the ENN Railway. Between this 1887 grant and several subsequent smaller grants, this great land grab amounted to almost 20% of Vancouver Island and purported to unilaterally transform roughly 85% of island Hul'qumi'num Nation's traditional territory into fee simple, so-called private land, now largely operated as industrial forestry lands. At the moment of that transformation, the territory was governed by a complex system of Hul'qumi'num land and resource relations grounded in an Indigenous legal order that endures today. The land grants represent a profound and deliberate attempt at the erasure of Hul'qumi'num law. Indeed, this failure to recognize Hul'qumi'num law and its corresponding set of obligations and rights to land is a key source of what Justice Southin called, over 20 years ago, a cloud lowered over the whole province. This cloud looms large today, informing multiple ongoing proceedings before the BC courts, some of which involve the First Nations of the Hul'qumi'num. However, Hul'qumi'num law continues to serve as the foundation for the Hul'qumi'num ongoing relations with the territory. And as such, they have consistently pushed back against the failure to recognize Hul'qumi'num relations with the land as legal rights and obligations on their own terms. As stated by Penelakut Elder Augie Sylvester, quote, "Our people made a mistake when they said welcome to our lands with both hands up. We should have been saying get out of here and stay off the ocean. That's the only way our lands would have been saved. They need to hear that the land they are sitting on, the land where my ancestors lived and are buried, is our private land," end quote. This understanding of Hul'qumi'num law, of our swath, is the foundation of Hul'qumi'num ongoing relations with the territory. These enduring relations with land and place are where our story begins, and as we will explore today, they ground the narrative we hope our work will help to write about the future of land relations on Vancouver Island. In teaching me about our swath, our Hul'qumi'num laws, my uncle, Stamenus Elder George Harris, shared the following with me, quote, "I want to let you know that when I speak I speak from my heart, for my nation and for my people. The land is an inheritance that I received from our ancestors. Part of that inheritance includes the traditions and sacred and ceremonial rites that go with the land and our culture. I come from this land. My ancestors come from this land. I am now a living being for this generation, but my ancestors are connected to the land, and I appreciate what they've given me and what they've left behind for us. You cannot separate land and culture, end quote. This is true. Our swath, our laws come from the land. In the origin stories of the Hul'qumi'num, our first ancestors dropped from the sky. Through these stories, one can come to understand that our ancestors are associated with and embodied in the land. The telling of these stories, along with the experiences of these ancestors at these places, bring these legendary people to life. In essence, these places are the ancestors. They are places where the Hul'qumi'num legal tradition can be applied, studied, perfected, and taught. As one travels throughout the Coast Salish world, the places where these first ancestors fell are marked by contemporary village sites and stone landmarks. For example, in the Cowichan Valley, Sialitsa was the first ancestor to fall from the sky. He fell to the warm ground of Cowichan near the Coxila Ridge. His younger brother, Stetson, was the second ancestor who dropped from the sky. He and his legendary dog, Wahas, landed at Swahas, Mount Prevost. If one looks carefully at Swahas, one can see the face of Stetson in the profile of this mountain. His very being is indelibly inscribed in the land, while his descendants and namesakes continue to share a special connection to this area. The sites where these first ancestors dropped and traveled serve as a reminder to the Hul'qumi'num of their historic and continuing relationships to one another and the land. Just as the first ancestors of the original communities were interrelated through kin, so too are their living descendants, as the first ancestor and transformer stories provide a linking narrative for property-owning family groups. The ancestors' use of resources, skills, and technologies provided guidance for how these properties should be cared for and respected. Through establishing relationships between people, places, and cultural practices, the first ancestor stories offer Hul'qumi'num an important foundation of property law, which is reinforced through song, story, ceremony, customary, and other deliberative practices. This land is not owned in the colonial legal sense because Hul'qumi'num people literally belong to the land and the natural world. And this belonging creates ongoing relationships and obligations which regulate access to land and resources, including where and how they can be shared within and external to that family group. Accordingly, relationships between extended networks of kin are critical for understanding the workings of local systems of land and resource tenure. While common residence in a village or settlement does offer access to areas in the collective commons, where you live is not as important socially, economically, and politically as who your family is and what properties, both real and intangible, your family belongs to. The idiom of sharing is one of the inherent legal principles that emanates from the concept of swath. Swath is a Hul'qumi'num word that has many glosses in English, from teachings to our way of life or our way of being on Mother Earth. Accordingly, it touches on all aspects of life and is inseparable from Hul'qumi'num relations to each other, the natural world, and the spiritual world. It is also legal in nature. Through the principles that emanate from swath, such as relationality, respect, trust, sharing, love, forgiveness, and responsibility. Hul'qumi'num can determine standards and practices of judgment and decision-making that help to regulate relationships and resolve disputes. One important area the principle of sharing operates is in the way it significantly influences laws associated with land and resource ownership and access. In an economy that thrives on the reciprocal use of owned resource locations, the idiom and practice of sharing are important to maintain opportunity and future access beyond one's own residence group's area. This is reflected through practices that provide norms and standards for the access rights of kin to family or community-owned locales, and the development of protocols that allow for non-kin to access community and family-owned resource sites in certain circumstances. It is also reflected in the restriction of access to resource areas and land. Outsiders whose behavior towards resource management could not be controlled through social pressures, such as embarrassment and ostracizing, were oftentimes not permitted to use these resource areas. In fact, sometimes they were summarily killed if found encroaching on the territory. Hence, access to resource areas and lands is limited to people who understand the law. As these examples illustrate, sharing is operationalized through relationality, and this is an exercise of jurisdiction. Yet our protocols for sharing have not been respected.
Hul'qumi'num people's understanding of their obligations to land through their own laws endured through assertions of colonial jurisdiction. This includes the presumptive power to impose an overlay of interests that challenged and sought to undermine Hul'qumi'num relations with their territory, particularly the production of fee simple property through colonial law. As delegations of Hul'qumi'num leadership repeatedly told colonial authorities, Hul'qumi'num peoples had clear expectations that their interest in the land would be respected by newcomers. Their willingness to share was dependent on their conditions being met about where and how this might occur. While there was early interest in the potential for a treaty with the newcomers, it became clear to Hul'qumi'num people that the new arrivals did not plan to abide by their longstanding systems of land governance and property relations. Despite repeated acknowledgements of Hul'qumi'num property interests and the need to negotiate and compensate prior to European settlement, in the late 1850s, Governor James Douglas began to survey the territory for settlement without permission, treaty, or compensation. Scrip was issued in 1858, though notably at 1/4 of the price, given the need to settle the quote, Indian question of title. Eventually, even these minimal formalities were circumvented by a makeshift preemption system unauthorized by imperial authorities. The arrival of settlers on gunboats in Cowichan territory, you can just survive, was the most vivid material manifestation of the failure to abide by Hul'qumi'num protocols for sharing. Most infamously, the HMS Hecate arrived while the majority of community members were away in seasonal fishing settlements on the Fraser River, now the subject of ongoing litigation. While Douglas claimed to have effected a land surrender, even fellow settler observers doubted its legitimacy, and the promised compensation never materialized. And of course, all of this was and remains unlawful under Hul'qumi'num law. As Douglas himself predicted, white settlers arriving without permission failed to accord with protocols for sharing were considered trespassers. Indeed, as Professor Douglas Harris has noted, the use of trespass to exclude settlers from reserve lands became a crucial exercise of Hul'qumi'num authority vis-a-vis the Cowichan fishery. Incursions were met with the assertion of Hul'qumi'num authority over territory, from the removal of survey stakes to active and sometimes violent resistance, to the strategic use of colonial law through petitions, deputations, and when Hul'qumi'num people were forced into colonial courts. Resistance to the alienation of Hul'qumi'num territory and resources was active at the time of the culminating event of colonial dispossession, the land grants for the ENN Railway. As we noted at the outset, these massive grants, complete with tax-free status for all related economic activity, unilaterally affected a radical transformation of Hul'qumi'num land and resources. The impacts are still unfolding today, as Sarah will detail shortly, with new forms of enclosure compounding the old ones. Without any process for consent or compensation when the size and scope of the grant was or it remains unclear when the size and scope of the grant was appreciated by Hul'qumi'num peoples. But the tradition of resistance to alienation of their lands and extraction of resources continued unabated through the era of the ENN, an ongoing exercise of jurisdiction over their territory. The 1909 petition to the king asserted that Cowichan peoples had been possessors and occupants of their territory, and this was recognized and protected, they asserted, by the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This is understood as a landmark moment in Indigenous peoples' engagement with colonial law still today. As the claimed fee simple changed hands from Robert Dunsmuir's ENN Railway Company to the Canadian Pacific Railway to the large integrated forestry companies of the 20th century, and finally to the current financial investors and public pension fund owners, relations with territory have become increasingly abstracted from the territory itself, transforming finally into a financialized market commodity. The long history of colonial incursions and the details of Hul'qumi'num resistance have been documented by the communities themselves, in the records of government officials and the media, and by historians, scholars, and lawyers, some of whom have had the honor of being Southern lecturers before us. While the details differ and a range of explanations have been provided for how things unfolded on Vancouver Island, all illustrate the profound and deliberate failure to engage with Hul'qumi'num relations with land as expressions of legal jurisdiction, specifically with the established and enforced protocols for sharing and access to territory. Many commentators have noted Douglas's recognition of Indigenous interest in land in the early years of colonial presence in Cowichan territory. And indeed, it may seem remarkable given the complete terra nullius approach that followed after him. However, equally notable is that even at this apparent high point, these interests were only cognizable when translated and exercised through colonial land governance and assimilation, not just of language and culture, but of legal framework. Indigenous peoples, he maintained, would have rights to property equal to white settlers, but those were not the relationships, rights, and obligations Hul'qumi'num peoples were asserting, those embedded in Indigenous systems of land governance already regulating relations with territory. And nonetheless, his successors rejected even this kind of formal equality. Nothing could illustrate the contrast between the recognition of settler and Indigenous property rights more than British Columbia's swift and sweeping action to protect white settlers whose preempted land was caught up in the ENN belt. Under the Vancouver Island Settlers' Rights Act, they were granted fee simple title to portions of the ENN belt where they could demonstrate they had, quote, occupied or improved lands with a bona fide intention of living thereon. The government granted further Hul'qumi'num lands to the ENN Railway to compensate for these losses to the original grants. This failure to recognize Hul'qumi'num legal relations with land on their own terms remains central to contemporary Aboriginal law and thus to the limitations of the legal reconciliation it mandates and the ongoing harm it facilitates in island Hul'qumi'num territory.
This failure to recognize expressions of Hul'qumi'num property relations continues to have devastating impacts on the Hul'qumi'num Esquimalt. These impacts are best articulated in the voices of the community members themselves. And so we'd like to share a few quotes with you. Many community members have commented on the issues related to access to important places, such as locked gates or lack of privacy. Late Elder West Modeste told me, Our access to the resources from the forest floor has been cut off by privatization. Our territory is filled with modern gates, blocking our trails and affecting our people's freedom of movement all over parts of our territory. Cowichan Elder Lestream Arva Charlie shared, right in our core territory, close to home, where we used to fish, hunt, gather plants or material things and bathe. It's all private lands now. Signs are up that say no trespassing or trespassers will be prosecuted. As Cowichan member Tim Kulczyski so aptly stated, our access to land has been so heavily eroded that we are essentially restricted to our reserve lands. Several community members described having to drive and travel hours to find medicines and important plants, and finding sacred places open to the general public, making spiritual work impossible. Others described the fear of being met with legal consequences for accessing land and resources. Activities on private land are also affecting Hul'qumi'num rights to culture and property, because both the lack of access and the environmental devastation wrought by industrial extraction makes the exercise of customary practices and the ability to transmit these laws difficult, if not impossible. Chad Harris described the loss of intergenerational knowledge transfer. Because we learn things by going on walks, private property and fences has had a devastating effect on our future generations. They can't learn oral teachings or spiritual teachings connected to these places. Late Joey Caro described the inability to fulfill cultural obligations to protect our ancestral remains. The destruction of burial sites on private property has led to sadness, anger, frustration, and fear for our families. He described raising this at the negotiation table and being told by a senior federal negotiator that he was tired of hearing about, quote, those damn bones. Martina Joe noted the intergenerational cultural impact of being unable to access bathing sites. If a gate is up, our young people start to feel as though they are doing something wrong by going for a bath. They start to worry about what mainstream society finds acceptable as opposed to our cultural practices. She described having to shower after spiritual bathing because the water was polluted. That contradicts the entire event. I was taught that you go for a bath to wash everything off you, and you leave the water on you to help protect you. It defeats the purpose of going for a bath if you have to wash all of it off. Similarly, Hul'qumi'num Chief Rick Thomas reflected on the impact of pollution on medicinal plants. My grandmother taught me that we have to gather plants from where it is clean and where there is no contamination. Sometimes I look and see something like a plant that I think I could use, but I don't because I know it's not clean. Cultural loss is also linked to economic loss, as central components of the Hul'qumi'num economy have been harvested or destroyed by logging. Community members spoke about the impact of aggressive timber extraction on the territory, including the loss of access to cedar for canoe building, weaving, and other crucial cultural activities, and impacts on the fishery. Cowichan Elder Lestream Arva Charlie described how industrial logging created scarcity within the traditional territory and recounted feeling as though he and his community had to quote unquote steal their own traditional foods from private lands. Chief Lydia Huitsum noted the transformation of the forest from the cycle of clear cutting and plantation reforestation. The forestry principles which lead to the use of pesticides do not value those aspects of the forest which are important to Cowichan people. A healthy forest has a diversity of species and age classes and provides us with medicinal plants, berries, and wildlife habitats, and protects the watercourses we need to continue our traditional activities. A crop of coniferous trees with a closed canopy provides none of these things. Our colleague, geographer Mike Eakers, has documented the tremendous value of just the timber extracted in the past 10 years. the benefit of which has flowed to the claimed fee simple owners, not Hul'qumi'num peoples, and for the most part, not to the broader BC public. Given all of these profound harms, one would think that there would be responsive colonial legal mechanisms, particularly in the age of reconciliation. Yet the reality of island Hul'qumi'num peoples is a cautionary tale about how far existing tools can take us.
Many of you will know that the colonial legal system has developed tools purportedly aimed at protecting Indigenous rights and territory from harm. Yet the entanglement of Hul'qumi'num and colonial relations illustrates the profound shortcomings of these spaces within contemporary Aboriginal law. The project of reconciliation set out in Delgamuukw is mediated through Section 35 of the Constitution and its promise to recognize and affirm existing Aboriginal rights and interests. Yet the story of the Great Land Grab demonstrates how engagement with these tools may in fact entrench and compound dispossession because they fail to engage with Hul'qumi'num systems of land governance as law, and to see Hul'qumi'num relationships with land as lawful and cognizable on their own terms. In particular, the overlay of fee simple on the territory creates significant barriers to the use of existing colonial legal mechanisms to recognize and protect Hul'qumi'num interests and jurisdiction, as subsequent third-party interests are prioritized for so-called equitable reasons. Despite being the only constitutionally protected property right in Canada, Aboriginal title has an unsettled and uneasy relationship with fee simple. In the over 2 decades since Justice Southin's acknowledgement of the cloud, this unresolved relationship placed over the province, Canadian governments and courts have more often than not avoided uncomfortable questions by presuming fee simple title largely or entirely extinguishes or displaces Indigenous land relations. Indigenous peoples are transformed into non-owners as third-party interests are unilaterally granted priority, leaving Indigenous relations defined by distance and exclusion from the primary and exclusive relations structured by fee simple. Even where Indigenous relations with land have been recognized through colonial law, they have been characterized as highly attenuated and incapable of realization because of the overlay of later fee simple interests that cannot be disturbed regardless of the legality of their origins. In a case brought by a neighbor of the island Hul'qumi'num communities at the northern edge of the ENN belts, who Pachasset land relations were characterized as existing but incapable of realization, not because of any actual legal impediment to addressing the question, but because the Crown's treaty negotiation policy excluded private lands. Essentially, their title cannot be realized because the Crown said so. Indeed, the only Supreme Court declaration of Aboriginal title simultaneously denies the application of terra nullius in Canada and affirms the Crown's underlying title, re-entrenching what Professor Brenna Bandar calls the mythic foundation of the Crown's freedom to grant interest to whomever it pleased. Characterized as a burden on the Crown's underlying title, Hul'qumi'num relations are subjected simultaneously to the presumed primacy of the ensuing line of third-party interests and the mythical innocent purchaser deserving of equity's protection, and the exercise of Crown jurisdiction and regulatory power, which in the case of private forest lands further entrenches the inviolability of fee simple relations. Hul'qumi'num jurisdiction, the power to make decisions about people-place relations, is presumed to have been displaced. First, by an unregulated private owner with discretion to extract, destroy, and alienate it at will, then by a public forestry regime under which private forest lands were managed for the same sustained yield and timber values as so-called Crown forests, and finally now by an exceptionally permissive and bare bones private managed forests act that leaves the absentee owners, many of Canada's public pension holders, to treat the territory as a financial investment without consideration of Indigenous relations with the land, biodiversity and environmental protection, and the welfare of the watersheds within. Yet as we and others like Gordon Christie, John Burroughs, and Kent McNeil have argued, the granting of fee simple cannot and would not have displaced the collective governance element of Hul'qumi'num title to their lands. Because a fee simple is not governmental in nature, but simply it is incapable of taking up this space. Indigenous more than ownership jurisdiction transcends the boundaries of colonial courts' articulations of Aboriginal title, reflecting a much broader range of people-place relations encompassing all the lands, waters, more than human beings, ancestors, spiritual entities, and the territory itself. Recognizing the immense complexities of the relationship between Indigenous relations with land and settler economies and political structures, Delgamuukw signaled early on that Aboriginal title should be dealt with in a government-to-government context. But island Hul'qumi'num nations' experiences illustrate the literal roadblocks to meaningful nation-to-nation relations, where Indigenous interests and obligations are entangled with claimed fee simple. In the words of Penelakut elder Augie Sylvester, they're trying to give a treaty now. They're right, private land won't be on the table. That's our private land. We need for them to hear that. People say I'm too harsh, but the only thing white people understand is harsh words, end quote. Faced with a refusal to address the great land grab at the treaty table and private land as off the table, the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group resorted to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to get recognition of how the treaty process violated their rights to property, culture, and restitution. In granting the treaty group's petition to have their case heard, the commission found, quote, the BC treaty process has demonstrated that it is not an effective mechanism to protect the right to property, and went further to find that Canadian courts do not provide, quote, due process of law to protect the property rights of the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group to its ancestral lands, end quote. The current willing buyer, willing seller construct adopted to address private land in the treaty process only further entrenches the failure to engage with Hul'qumi'num law, echoing Douglas's equality through Indigenous preemption rights. Land back is only possible where Hul'qumi'num frameworks for land relations and their more than ownership jurisdiction can be transformed into fee simple title by the market with the consent and compensation for private landowners. Yet we are not here today to simply tell a story of an intractable clash of legal orders and relations with place. Our goal is transformational, to lay the groundwork necessary to reimagine the entanglement of people-place relations and account for how much more there is than ownership in island Hul'qumi'num territory. While we firmly believe that some of the industrial claimed fee simple lands can and should be returned to island Hul'qumi'num nations alongside full and fair compensation for the profound losses resulting from the great land grab, today we are most concerned with the reality of ongoing entanglement in which fee simple holders may continue to hold interests in the land, but in a future where those interests are governed by a framework grounded in Hul'qumi'num legal principles and Hul'qumi'num jurisdiction. This is a trans-systemic project that grounds a conversation about how to live in island Hul'qumi'num territory in accordance with the systems of relationships, obligation, and of care the Hul'qumi'num peoples have developed with the more than human world to which they belong. Rather than seeking to reconcile island Hul'qumi'num peoples to colonial legal relations being here to stay, as Delgamuukw said, and as current litigation and treaty processes do, we seek to reconcile the overlaid colonial interest to Hul'qumi'num jurisdiction. As Marie Baptiste and Sakich Henderson observe about trans-systemic thinking, knowledge systems can learn from each other to transcend existing categories. This work of regulating shared interests and obligations is not unfamiliar to Hul'qumi'num law, which has evolved not only to manage the overlap and intersection of multiple kinds and sources of human relationships to place, but to do so in ways that sustain ecological and spiritual relations through reciprocal obligations. Indeed, it is not even so unfamiliar to the common law systems of property relations, which have always adapted to create space for fragmented and overlapping interests in land and have never reflected the mythology of absolute property rights. This will take a kind of trans-systemic legal creativity we have not seen much of in settler state legal systems, not because it is not possible, but because it requires a deep and meaningful engagement with Indigenous legal orders, which by definition unsettles the mythic foundations of colonial property systems, crown title, and crown sovereignty. Thus, it is in many ways our own imaginative capacity to embrace unknown futures by telling the truth about the past. As Batiste and Henderson note, transsystemic thinking pushes us to see how the new can emerge from possibility to actuality, how we can, in their words, affirm becoming over being. In island Hul'qumi'num territory, this is about both unraveling our understanding of what fee simple is and means, and articulating the principles that will guide the implementation of Hul'qumi'num jurisdiction in an entangled future.
The legal principles that emanate from Su-taxwiye can help determine standards and practices for judgment and decision-making that help to regulate relationships and resolve disputes. In the next few minutes, I'd like to share a bit about what this might entail in the context of people-place relationships in the Hul'qumi'num territory. However, before I share our initial thinking with you, I want to preface my comments that time prevents me from fully capturing the complexities and nuances that exist within the Hul'qumi'num legal tradition. Thus, know that these principles never operate in isolation of one another, and the corresponding teachings from our Su-taxwiye helps one to understand the complexities involved in applying these principles. The first principle that I would like to share with you is the principle of consensus. Although at a recent meeting, it was expressed to me that perhaps a better term would be collaboration. Within the Coast Salish world, the idea of consensus is considered a key aspect of resolving disputes because it embodies the principles of kinship, promoting healthy relationships and fostering harmony within the community. My elder, the late George Seymour, once described a collaborative process and explained how the parties involved in the dispute, along with respected individuals who had relevant knowledge on the subject matter, would gather and discuss a matter until they arrived at a resolution that was acceptable to everyone. If this principle was to be reflected in a transsystemic process today, those impacted by decisions about forest lands in the ENN belt, whether they be fee simple private landowners, Hul'qumi'num community leaders, or specific Hul'qumi'num families with connections to certain places within that territory, would all participate in the process on an equal footing. Individuals with relevant knowledge, whether from a Hul'qumi'num legal or cultural perspective, or a Western science perspective, could also be invited to join into the process to help inform everyone involved on particular issues. Incorporating the idea of consensus into land use governance would not only uphold the principle of kinship, but would also promote the Hul'qumi'num legal principles of trust and respect for the overall decision-making process. In Hul'qumi'num legal processes, it is also recognized that consensus building is not always possible in all circumstances. Given the history and legal complexity of the issue we have spoken about today, it is possible that the Hul'qumi'num land question is one such circumstance. However, this does not mean that the issue is incapable of a mutually acceptable resolution. In instances where Hul'qumi'num Estimuth were unable to use collaboration to resolve a legal issue, other legal principles and processes were drawn upon. For example, individuals or groups in conflict could choose to call upon a CM or respected leader, an arbiter of sorts, to help decide the issue. The principle of consensus or collaboration was utilized in identifying and selecting the CM. However, the decision rests with the CM and their decision was final. In addition to these dispute resolution processes, Hul'qumi'num Big House practices, such as the use of speakers and witnesses, could be incorporated to foster accountability by those involved in the decision-making processes and to promote trust and respect for the ultimate decisions. Within the Coast Salish world, speakers are individuals who are highly trained in the background, history, language, and culture of the people they represent, and who are respected and trusted for their judgment in terms of the words they choose to use. They are chosen by the families involved in the issue or the work and speak on behalf of those families. It is thought that the use of speakers helps to quiet emotions and foster equality in the decision-making process. Within the Coast Salish world, witnesses are often called at the outset of important work and decision-making. These individuals are responsible for listening and observing to what goes on and remembering it into the future in case any conflict arises out of a misunderstanding related to the events, and to ensure that all parties, are held to their word and trust is maintained. Incorporating these practices alongside collaborative decision-making with Indigenous people could help rebuild trust and respect between the parties so that they can manage the territory together and in a good way. According to the Hul'qumi'num legal tradition, it is not only the relationships and obligations between humans that matter, but the relationships between and obligations owed to all beings. Thus, in line with the principles of kinship and responsibility, building and maintaining good and respectful relations and fulfilling reciprocal obligations to kin, broader society, and the more than human world would be central to the exercise of Hul'qumi'num jurisdiction. The role of decision makers would necessarily expand and shift from resource management to a stewardship role, requiring not only a conceptual understanding of what it means to be in relationship with particular places governed by Hul'qumi'num law, but to also be on the land, observing, communicating, and interacting with it. In this way, consensus-seeking processes would better incorporate the full knowledge of kin relations decision-makers are responsible to uphold. For example, decision-making would need to consider how forestry practices might specifically impact the ability of the Hul'qumi'num Esquimalt to care for their ancestors and their final resting places, as well as any future generations who will depend on these lands and resources. Rather than focusing on the needs of human actors and implementing blanket criteria for environmental sustainability or protection, the beings of the more than human world would be understood as actors with whom relationships must be fostered and nurtured on an ongoing basis in particular places, and obligations and duties fulfilled. While economic benefits are generally associated with financial gain, from a Hul'qumi'num perspective, the overall net effect of decisions on relationships may be most important. The social, environmental, and economic benefits could be considered holistically in assessing overall effects. Thus, rather than simply identifying individual environmental concerns and responding in isolation, decisions about the actions of owners would be managed by proactively asking questions informed by Hul'qumi'num conceptions of relationality and obligations. For example, how will this decision or action affect the soil, the water, fish, and other beings and their relations? What obligations do we owe the soil? Do we owe the fish and water, etc.? What is the standard that must be met in order to meet our obligations? The process of answering these questions would then be ongoing to respond to the needs of the territory as it changes over time. As one can see from a Hul'qumi'num perspective, resource management is primarily the management of the users and not the resource.
Through the ENN land grants, the colonial state attempted to write a one-dimensional and unilateral story on the landscape we now call Vancouver Island. But that story was never complete, and while it obscured, it could not erase Hul'qumi'num relations with place. The story we need now is a trans-systemic one grounded in the systems of relationship, obligation, and care Hul'qumi'num peoples have been writing with the landscape since the time of the first ancestors. One that realizes the elders' vision of a footprint on the whole of territory. It is a transformational story, not just for island Hul'qumi'num peoples who have waited so long for justice, but for all of us who will be gifted with the opportunity to learn to live in accordance with the laws of a place so that we can care for and heal the land alongside ourselves.
Very much for that. As a property teacher and scholar, I love the story and learned a lot today. We have some time for Q&A. So I wonder if there are any questions from the audience.
Yes, so when we talk about the Hul'qumi'num Esquimalt, we're primarily talking about those First Nations who have come together to negotiate a treaty under the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group. And they've done so because they see themselves as interrelated through their relationships to land, culture, kin, language, and so forth. And so the territory extends north to just below the Nanaimo River, east to down the Fraser to Hul'qumi'num, Lulu Island, including the Vancouver Islands, the southern Vancouver Islands, south to around Malahat, and then west to Lake Cowichan, the edge of Lake Cowichan. So that's how those nations have defined their core traditional territory, although there's a great paper by Brian Tom, and we were talking a little bit about this last night, about how the process of being in the treaty processes forces nations to define sort of like a core element of territory, although I would say that they have relations with other places based on kinship relations that they've been able to create and maintain with other nations throughout the Coast Salish world. Yeah, that is correct.
It's managed by Mosaic, but in fact, the ownership of it is with the three public pension funds. Yeah. With Mosaic? I mean, there's sort of been ebbs and flows in terms of, I think, the different conversations that particular nations have. There are some kind of memorandums of understanding for certain things, but there's no conversation about the return of that territory. And in 2019, the BC government actually launched a review of the Private Managed Forest Lands Act, under which all of that is managed. And many submissions were given, including from Indigenous nations whose territory is affected by the regime. And we have heard absolutely nothing from the government on that change. So we don't, there's not a kind of table where that conversation about the change of the regime is happening right now, but we have put forward suggestions for what we would see as part of that, and have a forthcoming paper actually that details that as well.
I'll attempt to answer this a bit, but it's really captured in this quote of footprint on the whole of the territory. So our community are in relations with non-Hul'qumi'num people, and we recognize the challenges in getting back 85% of the territory that was taken from it. I think our eyes are very much wide open. We've been in treaty since 1993. Like, we are continually sort of thinking about how we can have influence or jurisdiction or have a footprint on 100% of the territory. And so as we shared, some of that might mean land back, right? In certain circumstances, but in other places of the territory, depending on our relationship to that place or what our legal obligations are to that place, we think that there's other ways that we could exercise jurisdiction in relation to that. And that's really what this project is all about, like looking at this very complicated question, both from a practical perspective and a legal perspective, and thinking about how can we still realize both Hul'qumi'num vision and assert Hul'qumi'num laws or jurisdiction in some way, shape, or form over 100% of the territory, and what would that look like? And so we're thinking creatively about that. Yeah.
Thank you. If fee simple title is in a sense off the table in the current treaty process or treaty processes in Canada generally and Columbia in particular, is there any forum in which some reconciliation or even a conversation can be had around fee simple title, the interests of fee simple title holders and the holders of Aboriginal title, short of court determination of Aboriginal title, which, as I understand, the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in Hul'qumi'num describes the Indigenous interest in Aboriginal title as ownership and control. And as I'm sure you're aware, been proposed by Professor Burrows and others that a determination of Aboriginal title completely undermines the basis for grants of derivative interests from Crown title. So is there a forum where government policy against the inclusion of fee simple lands in the discussion of treaty making can take place? Or are we stuck with absolutes? Include conversation. By the way, just in the interest of disclosure, my name's Harry Slade. Yeah. So, by the way, I'm here with two other retired Superior Court judges.
No pressure.
And thank you very much for the presentation. But these are such critical questions in my mind. And I headed up the Specific Claims Tribunal where we grappled with a little bit of this. So thank you for your indulgence in hearing my question, my rather long-winded question.
I mean, I think the constraints of what Aboriginal title asks in terms of fitting into its box, as well as what it can provide, is part of why we are really trying to expand what we're thinking about in terms of this idea of jurisdiction, because we think it can account for both opportunities for ownership as defined by Hul'qumi'num law, so not necessarily in the form of fee simple. I think that's kind of a crucial element of this, that the outcome of treaty and the outcome of these processes shouldn't be the transformation of Hul'qumi'num legal interests into something that the colonial law recognizes for simplicity, that we have to have this kind of trans-systemic conversation to say what else is out there, but also to say that there will be different forms that the relationship of jurisdiction is going to take throughout the territory. And that, you know, if we acknowledge that fee simple can't subsume that jurisdictional element of even how Canadian courts have defined Aboriginal title, then that aspect of the relationship to land should be on the treaty table. This question of jurisdiction is properly before it. And of course, it's complicated. It's going to be a very difficult conversation, but it's not as if the conversations we're already having aren't difficult. So it's a kind of what we think about as this kind of legal creativity to think outside those boxes through this question of jurisdiction. And some other scholars call this kind of jurisdiction back in response to the kind of land back frame. But there are also lots of interesting, very grounded conversations within the territory happening between different Indigenous and non-Indigenous community entities about what this can look like and how to uplift Hul'qumi'num jurisdiction through a variety of kind of collaborative ideas around watershed management and pushing the envelope in terms of land management, even with respect to the private lands.
Yeah, and in terms of moving forward the private property issue, I mean, that is of central concern to the Hul'qumi'num peoples, because 85% of our traditional territory is in the hands of private landowners, which means we come to the negotiation table with 15%, but it's not even 15% like on before us, open for negotiation. And then compensation is not also on the table for negotiation. So that is not, like, our elders do that, they cannot wrap their minds around this, where they, I've been at tables where they've stood up and said, show us when did we give you these lands? Like, when did we say it was okay and that there would be no compensation for it? And so there's a lot of creative thinking and a lot of avenues being pursued by the Hul'qumi'num nations in doing this. We made reference to the petition we made to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. We're successful at the admissibility phase to get to the merits phase, which was significant because you have to exhaust domestic remedies. And Canada was making the argument that we hadn't exhausted domestic remedies because we hadn't brought a title claim forward and we're still in treaty negotiations. So they said, we have remedies that are perfectly acceptable, and Hul'qumi'num just hasn't engaged in them. So this shouldn't go forward. But as Estair shared, the claim was found to be admissible, and it was a claim based on the fact that that the private property issue violated the right to culture, the right to property, and the right to restitution. And our community will say they are not happy with the Inter-American Commission right now, because we did get to successfully, our elders all went down to Washington, D.C., and we had a decision, or we had a hearing on the merits, but that decision has not, it's been 10 plus years and we have not had a decision on that yet. I also know that at the BC treaty process, the chief negotiators meet, and they used to have a mechanism called a common table, where they would come together to try to push against government mandates and get some changes. And I've heard recently that there has been changes on some issues that have been very challenging at some tables. So I think they are turning their minds critically to the legal status of land and thinking about how they can make challenges there. But I think they're pragmatic, and they know you sort of have to attack this issue from all ends and see where we can get a footprint, on the territory little by little. we're in it for the long game. Our elders say, they've been waiting. We'll wait for longer,
Hey, we're all in it for the long game.
Yeah.
If I may, just another piece here. If fee simple lands are not available for repatriation to Indigenous ownership, Aboriginal title in a treaty process, that'll be the case that as fee simple title holders or other tenure holders can't just do whatever they wish on the land and with the resources. It's all subject to government regulation. Is there room in any existing treaty process for the definition of governance over territory that takes account of both Indigenous legal orders and colonial legal orders? Or does that just not happen in those processes? Thank you. I better give this back before I.
I will also share that we have two other partners in this research, and one is my dad, who is the chief negotiator of the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group. So he would probably be the best individual to ask this question, but that is what we're trying to explore here. So we're trying to come up with different models for exercising jurisdiction on 100% of the territory to help the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group through their negotiations at the table to help them see, to help government see what their minds cannot imagine as of yet, drawing on our own laws. Because I will say there is pluralism within Coast Salish law, and there is a legal pluralism within Hul'qumi'num law, and we have mechanisms and processes in place to deal with a plurality of laws. And I think that we can learn from that understanding of the relationship of laws and import it into, the greater Canadian legal structure in a way that will benefit us all, as we say. So that is really what we're trying. We haven't been able to delve in deep to that side of the research because of the challenges of doing primary research during COVID and how it affected the communities involved. But we're in person today. There's light at the end of the tunnel with that, we hope, and that's really what this work hopes to achieve.
And I think we can look outside of the Canadian context to see spaces in which that kind of legal creativity and conversations and engagements are happening. So I had the privilege of teaching and learning in Aotearoa, New Zealand for the beginning of my academic career. And I think that there's sometimes an excitement about the kinds of models that are coming out of the treaty settlements there around legal personality for natural features that doesn't actually necessarily go deeper to understand what those agreements were actually about, which is a very deep and meaningful engagement with Māori law and relationships with place. And so these particular iterations of legal personality for the Whanganui River or a legal entity for Te Arawera, they are legal compromises that are coming from long, difficult conversations that really are about illustrating where we can find that kind of trans-systemic creative thinking to come up with new ideas that transcend the existing legal categories. So I think about learning from them, not, we should adopt the idea of legal personality necessary, but learning from them that we can engage in that kind of work to figure out what the solutions that are meaningful and implement, have the potential to be successfully implemented in a particular place, because we would have to do that work by engaging deeply with the laws that were created of that place. So, I think we need to kind of think outside our box of what we can achieve through Aboriginal title litigation, or even the kind of intractable issues at the current treaty table and think about what we can become instead of what we already are.
I have the unenviable task of ending this really wonderful and rich conversation. I have the delightful task of presenting each of you with a small token of our appreciation. And please, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your work, and I'm sure we'll be here for a few more minutes if you want to come down and talk to the Professors Morales and Van Wagner personally. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.